are very valuable to the life of the city or the kind of movement through the city. So he began to kind of conduct research on that, and it remained a theoretical, it remained a book, but it was influential in thinking for many architects as well. So should the church then be co-opting different kind of organizations or different users in order to, or should it become co-opted by other dominant forces? These are kind of thoughts and provocations that we have. And finally, body to building. A church is a dynamic body of believers, but ultimately these believers need a dwelling place, so a kind of building. Should the church develop more people-centric events, perhaps, that will galvanize a community around it, along with its members? When we were in New York, we attended Times Square Church once. We were a little bit intimidated because, first of all, it really felt like going to a Broadway show, and secondly, it was a very loud Broadway show. And we couldn't really, it was very intimidating for those of us who are more used to traditional worship. But anyway, but it was basically, it prided itself, and it has a ticker just like the other Broadway shows, that on the left you see more than 100 nations congregate in this church. So, and it really prides itself as a kind of global church in Manhattan. So I believe this is our last, I think so. And Kun's going to join me. We can discuss. A lot of thoughts are still very raw, and but it's an ongoing research that has started to fascinate us in terms of the church as a figure in the city.
To see all those different cities. How many? 8, 10 different types or so, maybe even more. And then one of the things you said was that you see a sort of an evolution from the church as the center of the city towards all other kinds of centers you've got. But how does the involvement of all different denominations fit into that story? Because on a certain moment you also see that the church divides into different denominations. So instead of one center, already there you see that different centers or different symbols come up. Do you have an idea about that?
Well, I think the general tendency, I think, is as we move, I think, through the course of history, we begin to understand that it is more pluralistic. I think that society has to become more tolerant, and the multiple center is not something unique to a kind of church history, but it's really a kind of civilizational trajectory. So, in terms of it's a question about how we might give voice, or how a city accommodates these multiple, in a way, multiple strengths, multiple identities, and so on. I think one way I could say, I mean, maybe within an academic context, is that it does go through the process of secularization. I think everything is sort of evened out by maybe in our context. I think we are much driven by a kind of the economics of a city. I think Hong Kong is not unique. So that becomes the level playing field for everyone, taking out supposedly the kind of ideological center, which might be a religion or a government or another kind of identity. But in doing that, I think we also unwittingly give over to, I think, that the power of money, I think, was maybe alluded to even today in the sermon. It is in fact the thing that we might unwittingly be worshipping, right? I mean, that's also a clear kind of metaphor. So so I don't know if that really answers the question, but yeah.
I guess I want to bring up Tim again, and what some of his teachings, because I think it goes back also to the consciousness the church has of itself, and this question of context. Going through these, they are not the linear progression. Doesn't mean that a church who we now identify, a city that we now identify as a financial city, it's not also another city. They are actually overlapping. A financial city, in many cases, for example, in Europe and so on, built over those other cities. So all the layers are still very present. It's just, I guess, where we are in the cycle of things. And so going back to the question of centers versus, I think it's really how a church sees itself in its context, and also whether it takes any particular, I don't know, for lack of a better word, radical, a kind of I would say a very radical position to if it recognizes that it is in the context of, say, a highly financial or, so it's really, but I also don't think we don't think it's also a singular. How this is an architecture question, ultimately it is very much, because the way we're looking at it, a lot of them deal with the question of space, which is a big deal in the city, especially in a city that always uses density as a way to understand itself. And so density means a lot of people in a very tight space, and so spaces are very urgent. And not just spaces where people are in boxes, but spaces in which people actually still get to talk and hang out with each other. So that's very much, I guess, a question for us in our profession, which is why a lot of issues we deal with sound like they're beyond architecture, but they're very much integral.
Willem, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I love the 250, is it in medieval Europe, 250 people per square acre? In 105? Yeah, that was a shock. Yeah, that was incredible. Yeah, density, proximity, that was very helpful. I was curious, just watching this and kind of watching the phases of history unfold through up to the technocratic city, but through the political city and the privatized city and all that. If you were going to play prophet for Hong Kong, or prophetess, where do you think Hong Kong is going? Will it remain a privatized city? Or where do you think it'll be in 200 years?
I don't know if I can answer. Maybe I can answer the question in a roundabout way. I think the future of cities, I think that's intrinsically tied to the work architects do, because you're trying to, before you tell a client to part with a lot of money, you have to convince them that that's not for the fees, but for the construction of that artifice, that building that represents something to the owner of a piece of property. I think a lot is invested, not just in a kind of monetary sense, but also the identity of it. I think we will argue is equally sort of powerful. Then, when in a city like Hong Kong, I think at its current state is very pro-development, just very open to businesses and making things accessible. So it ranks very high in how it's very efficient. One way to maybe sort of counter that kind of efficiency is to also realize that in some statistics, you understand that Hong Kong ranks very high in infrastructure. For instance, the Mercer Quality of Life Index. It would rank Hong Kong number 6 in infrastructure, but then it would rank Hong Kong number 70 in quality of life. So quality of living in the city. So that kind of discrepancy tells you that Hong Kong has to slow down at some point, and maybe people fleeing away to the outer lying islands in search for some kind of peace and some kind of escape is already a sign. I think there are communities out there who are which are thriving and enjoying life away from the city, and they come ever so often for meetings in the city. That's one future that's already present in a way. Slowing down, maybe I think all cities, looking at infrastructure, Hong Kong is building its infrastructure quite rapidly. The MTR kind of network is very clear. Critics have sometimes called it every MTR line a kind of cash corridor, because it represents a very uneven development. Wherever an MTR station lands, it brings with it the forces of circulation, but also really money. So what if we begin to start to question our infrastructure, for example, and maybe slow it down? I mean, American cities are trying to reclaim public space and pull it away from, let's say, automobile traffic and so on. Whereas I think Hong Kong doesn't have a very direct kind of response to that yet. But yeah, sort of giving over the harbour front and so on, instead of continually giving it over to infrastructure and so on. Yeah.
I can add to that to give 3 case studies in the last, I would say, 30 years. The first case would be in Rome. There's already, I think, at least one, but I heard there's more, highway that has already been demolished. And this is very radical, because I don't think we demolish highways, we build highways. And it hasn't been demolished because there is already realization that it's destroying neighborhoods. And Rome in particular is because it's such a layered, it's a very thick city, literally. If you did cut across Rome, you can see the history of Rome. So that is one example that's already happening, and it radically changes neighborhoods already, simply by just removing that thing. So another case was in Brazil, in a little city called Curitiba, which in the 80s had a mayor who was somewhat enlightened and decided to kind of promote public transport, but very kind of as a social enterprise. So co-opting the entire city to kind of run their own MTR and their rail and so on. That has proven to be pretty effective, because everybody felt that they are part of, like, everybody wants to take public transportation. It's based on a variety of codes of honor and so on that makes a city see their transportation not just as a kind of objective movement vehicle where you pay to get in, but that they're part of this. And the last example is in Seoul, the middle of Seoul. Historically, there was a river that runs in the heart of Seoul, and that development has kind of built over it, and it was forgotten. And I forgot who triggered it. Yeah, and it was a highway over it too. And I don't remember who triggered it, but about 10 years ago, right, there was a huge. The government invited globally sociologists, geographers, urban architects, urban planners, everyone to come together to think about how to kind of what to do with this particular area, and collectively. They decided that they should give it back to the people, where people come together rather than as a circulation, as a movement, which take people away. So they turned it into a linear park that follows. They dig out the water, took out the highway, and now it's the most fun place in the city that draws people there from all over, even not just in Korea, but that's the place we visit when we want to go there. So there are many examples in which I think my professor at Columbia told me years ago that he is very positive in believing in human caprice, and that things move in cycles. I don't know if it's true, but that at some point there's realization, there's some kind of kickback mechanism in which that history doesn't go in it. The privatized city probably wouldn't go linearly forever. Just as we saw all the different cities, Babylon came to a screeching halt, and so on. So it's hard to predict the next 200 years, but it's really, it will be very productive to look at the present and what is already being done, and find a lot of spaces of hope.
Hello. I want to echo his point. It depends very much on how church sees itself, I would say. Whether church is like so totally only a place to worship God and then give honor to God, or it actually incorporates the function of serving the community as well. So what I see in Hong Kong is that because of the limitation of space, so many churches are being forced to find their place within a residential building or a commercial building. But then there are also churches that they fund schools, and they are also holding worship sessions in the schools. And schools are also being used as like a community center to serve other people in the community, like giving out food, like giving teachings or tutoring children in Hong Kong. And then my question, I also have a question, is how do you see the functioning of churches evolved throughout the ages? So in the past, is it that people are holding church as an authority figure, so that's why they put it in the center of the city, and then since the function diminishes throughout the ages, so eventually becomes a place to retreat rather than being like center of the city. So yeah, how do you see the church's function changes throughout the ages?
One of the things that Kun keep reminding me to say that I forgot, which was how to start this, was to actually first have a qualifier that the figure of the city or our cities very much reflect the morality, actually, whether we like it or not, and values of the people who actually inhabit or make this city. So we can see throughout history that what the people that we also call the city, the people who make up the city, what they are centered. So it's very. So we see, like for example, those that are much more theocratic is because a lot of Islamic cities, for example, and also the Vatican City. That is kind of what's the law governing them. What's the primary moral center, if you have to put it that way. I want to just say something about this question of the homeless. I thought it was very radical once when I remember this was quite a few years ago. I had just finished school and just started attending Redeemer Church. And we were very late and it was really cold. So we ended up sitting in the last row. It was a huge congregation. And next to me, about a minute later, came a homeless person who he really smells. But either I have to stand or I stay where I am and last the next hour and a half, like next to him. I think we stay where we were. And at the end, it just struck me that there's this position about the homeless that is kind of more than just seeing the homeless as for the church to feed, but that the homeless needs to listen to God's word too. So they're not just, we don't just house them Monday to Friday or Saturday, and on Sunday we continue the service. And that was something I learned from that. It doesn't make it more desirable to, maybe we can provide showers for them, but it doesn't take away all the material, physical fact that they are still kind of a class in which most of us wouldn't be able to accept. But it did struck me that churches have seen the homeless that way mostly, and so to extend what you have pointed out, I think it's important to feed them materially, but also perhaps also have them enjoy what we are getting spiritually. So I don't know what that means.
But there's, I think again, that example resonates with some of these concepts that I think again to evoke another Keller sort of idea, which is again biblical in every sense of the word, that the idea of a church being a kind of all-powerful symbol with a building to stand for it is quite counterintuitive to the biblical sense of what a church is. I think early churches were roving and somehow decentered. It's really about this concept of the body of believers versus a kind of fixated building. And the concept that Keller evoked was the idea of a resident alien. And I think that might tie quite well with what your suggestions or observations are, that as a building, I think we can't deny the fact that now you have a building, you have a premise, that is safe and comfortable. But the fact about what are you doing with the building, that is to say, who can gain access to these buildings, how open is it to the outside, etc., etc. What kinds of program and events you fill it with is key. So for a long time, I think I'm not necessarily saying we're agreeing or disagreeing with it, but Redeemer back in New York did not want to own any buildings. They continued to rent, and maybe they're now paying for it because they did not have that kind of asset to now leverage against. But they constantly want to fluctuate between premise from the east side here, west side there. So every few years they would have some kind of stability when they have successive rental agreements that could be worked out with these host churches, or sometimes with Hunter College at the university. The fact is, do not give over to this the kind of accumulation of, as it were, wealth through real estate, which is what really our society mandates us to do. That we're now somehow it's demanded of us that we participate in this buying and selling of real estate in order not to be left behind. So that is one example. Again, I don't know if Redeemer had changed that idea, but it struck me as rather radical in that it's not about how much you can accrue or gain through what you have, but it's about how you could use the little resources that you have in a very transient way, in a very maybe faithful way, because I think they probably move from month to month, year to year, paying these rentals without knowing if they are having deep reserves to count upon. So I think that attitude might be very different. The concept of a kind of resident alien, that you never belong, but you're always trying to acclimatize and also give resources over back to the city that you're serving. So that's a concept. I'm going to give that question to you now. Thanks.
Yeah, very interesting talk. I really, really enjoyed it. I have one question about the privatized city, Hong Kong. What would be the perfect church building for a type of city like this? Is it like more open space? Arranging more public space, or a garden, or I'm very interested what your thoughts are on that.
We consciously didn't want to take that on because we know we're in a sort of a crossroad here, even at Union. So I don't know, Eunice? It's a bit about the future. I think we can take it on as a kind of future of the city, maybe in a more general way, without. Yeah.
I think we can answer this in a roundabout way, maybe. One of the things that it's important, as we said, also for us researching and also looking into this, is to find out in terms of space, only purely in terms of space, not even aesthetic, what are the kind of issues in a city here. And certainly public space is a very big issue, and public space in the sense that for all kinds of people, so that they do not become designated as ethnic or racial, because it has become like that already, that certain public spaces have been attributed to a certain race or even nationality and so on, without needing to name them. And so that is certainly one issue that I think a church can really participate. And as to exactly what, I think there's a whole spectrum. It doesn't mean that suddenly it's filled with kind of domestic workers. So it's not necessarily that, but really seeing what it means for a church to be a public space as well. And I think that is on perhaps a more social level as a kind of space and urban space. On another level, which is a more environmental level, I think it was touched on also last week, was in terms of the kind of quality of spaces in Hong Kong. And I think that's also a very critical issue, because as we looked at, really it is not great high quality. Perhaps housing is very expensive, property are expensive, but it doesn't translate to expensive quality of life, if you know, as in they do not, the dollar sign does not give you necessarily a better quality of living. And that's something that I think that it could, not in terms of housing, but more on a public level, a kind of access that we could also consider how we could do that. Whether it's really a space that open, for example, to give a very concrete example, that's open to the sky where people hang out is very rare in Hong Kong, which is why you see the streets doing that job now, and public parks that are doing this job now. So if a building or a space could actually give that kind of quality back. So there's a whole spectrum, but if we can start looking at them, they actually can yield very concrete proposals that would be more meaningful than thinking very simplistically in like large forms or shapes.
There are these concepts of, speaking of public spaces, there are these concepts even in a very, let's say, financially driven city. I mean, it's maybe not good enough just to reiterate that. But the city is doing something there's some successes. For instance, commercial development that would come with a requirement to provide, let's say, a bus terminal for public transportation, or privately owned public space that could give 24-hour access. The only question, of course, is that they are always grouped together with highly commercial activities that, even though a shopping mall is both a public space, but technically speaking, it is also a kind of it has a management that oversees the access of it. So there's a kind of implied membership. If you're not a consumer, you might feel very uncomfortable in spaces like IFC, even though they are generally open. And when that happens, you find that the kind of margins become quite well defined in that sense. We had a colleague also at the university, Jonathan, who looked at who provides the air conditioning, for example. So you look at bridges in Hong Kong and these sort of link walkways. The minute you encounter an air-conditioned, very comfortable space, you know it's probably not public, because it is. And these are some of these telltale signs: the temperatures of the city, the color. So we can see these boundaries at play if you just open your eyes in a way. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eunice and Kuhn. This is great. So upcoming, next week we have our Thanksgiving feast. And so we're not doing the well. We're all encouraged to attend the Thanksgiving feast. And then the week after that, we're doing the Christmas Fun Fair. And so there'll be lots of vendors